In this alternate history, millions of people born on American soil wake up one morning to find out they are no longer citizens, and there is no legal way back.
This story is fictional. It's based on real events, but everything beyond the known facts is speculation. Our goal is to explore an alternate timeline, not to rewrite history, but to imagine what might have been.
What if Congress abolished birthright citizenship? In July 2026, Speaker Mike Johnson told the country that birthright citizenship had devalued the 14th Amendment. He wasn't speaking in a vacuum. President Trump had already signed an executive order trying to limit automatic citizenship for children born on U.S. soil to non-citizen parents. The Supreme Court refused to rule on its merits, declining to strike it down outright, but also declining to endorse it. Justice Clarence Thomas dissented, arguing the court should go further and reconsider whether the 14th Amendment guaranteed birthright citizenship at all. The political pressure building inside Congress was enormous. Trump wanted action. Johnson wanted to deliver it. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, states that all persons born on U.S. soil and subject to its jurisdiction are citizens. For 158 years, that sentence had meant one thing. If you were born here, you were American. No asterisk. No exceptions. The political will to challenge that reading had never been stronger, and the judiciary had never looked more sympathetic. But what if Congress decided not to wait for the courts to act incrementally? What if, in the summer of 2026, Johnson pushed through a bill, the Citizenship Integrity Act, that redefined subject to the jurisdiction thereof to exclude children born to undocumented immigrants and temporary visa holders? And what if, 1 year later, a reshaped Supreme Court upheld it? The decision came down 5-4. The majority held that Congress had the power to define the scope of the Citizenship Clause, and that birthright citizenship had never been meant to extend universally. The dissent called it the most consequential rollback of constitutional rights since Dred Scott. Most legal scholars agreed with the dissent. It did not matter. Within weeks, the consequences no one had fully gamed out began to arrive. The first problem was retroactivity. The laws implementing regulations made no exception for people already born. Suddenly, hundreds of thousands of Americans who had lived their entire lives as citizens, paid taxes, graduated school, served in the military, were reclassified. The Department of Homeland Security began issuing notices. Birth certificates were no longer sufficient proof of citizenship if a parent's status at the time of birth could not be verified. A new federal birth citizenship registry was announced, and to confirm your status, you had to submit parental documentation going back to the year of your birth. For millions of families, those records were incomplete, lost, or had never existed in the form the government now required. The bureaucratic apparatus buckled immediately. Processing centers were overwhelmed and the backlog stretched to 18 months. Those flagged as potentially non-qualifying were placed in legal limbo, unable to obtain or renew passports, quietly let go by employers newly liable for hiring the undocumented, their bank accounts frozen pending status verification. Children were turned away from public schools in states that moved fastest to comply. People who had been American yesterday were something else today, and no one had a clear name for what they were. Internationally, the reaction was fast and brutal. Canada invoked its right to suspend visa-free travel agreements. The European Union issued a formal diplomatic rebuke and began reviewing trade protocols tied to human rights compliance standards. 3 American embassies in Western Europe received formal protest notes within the same week. Foreign direct investment, already sensitive to political risk, began to contract. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which had stayed quiet during the legislative fight, broke its silence to warn that the reputational damage was already costing the country billions in projected losses. The administration dismissed the projections as politically motivated. Inside the country, the fracture ran along geographic lines. California, Illinois, and New York announced they would not enforce the registry requirements at the state level. Texas, Florida, and a coalition of 14 other states moved aggressively to implement them. The result was a country where your citizenship status depended on which side of a state line you lived on. Federal courts were flooded with conflicting injunctions. The Supreme Court, which had created the crisis, declined to take emergency cases to resolve it. 3 years in, the United States had a permanent, legally defined underclass. The government's own estimates, leaked by a Census Bureau official before the Bureau was directed to stop publishing the figures, suggested between 2.3 and 4.1 million people now lived in a state of legal non-citizenship, born here, raised here, with no other country to claim them and no legal mechanism to become citizens of the country they had always believed was theirs. They could not get passports. They could not vote, access federal benefits, or leave and return. They were not deportable either, because no other country would take them. They existed in the only country they had ever known as a permanent legal anomaly. The 14th Amendment still sat in the Constitution, word for word as it always had. It had not been repealed. It had simply been interpreted into irrelevance, and the people it had once protected had no path back. The courthouse doors were now held shut by the very ruling meant to clarify the law. America had not descended into sudden chaos. It had done something slower and in some ways worse, built a system, stamped it with legal authority, and called it order.
In this world, history went one way. But here, we ask what could have happened. If you want more alternate timelines and government what-ifs, subscribe, comment your theory, and stay tuned. This is State of What If.